Ancient Irish Civilization by P.W. Joyce, Chapter 6. How Ireland Became the Most Learned Country in Europe. In old pagan times, long before the arrival of St. Patrick, there were schools in Ireland taught by Druids. And when at last Christianity came, and was spreading rapidly over the land, those old schools were still held on. But they were no longer taught by Druids, and they were no longer pagan, for teachers and scholars were now all Christians. But as soon as St. Patrick came, a new class of schools began to spring up. For he and the other missionaries founded monasteries everywhere through the country, and in connection with almost every monastery there was a school. These were what are called monastic or ecclesiastical schools, for they were mostly taught by monks, while the older schools, being taught by laymen, were called lay schools. In lay schools was taught what might be called the native learning, the learning that had grown up in the country in the course of ages. It consisted mainly of the following subjects: to read and write the Irish language, Irish grammar, and rules of poetical composition, a very extensive and complicated subject, geography and history, especially the topography and history of Ireland, and a knowledge of the poetry and of the historical and romantic tales of the country, while a great many of the schools were for professions, special schools of law, of medicine, of poetry, of history and antiquities, and so forth. In these last, the professional men were educated. These lay schools, being now within the Christian communion, were not abolished or discouraged in any way by St. Patrick or his successors. They were simply let alone, to teach their own secular learning just as they pleased. They continued on, and were to be found in every part of Ireland for 14 centuries after St. Patrick's arrival, down to a period within our own memory, but of course greatly changed as time went on. In later times they were much more numerous in Munster than in other provinces, and they taught, and taught well, classics and mathematics, and often both combined in the same school. I was myself educated in some of those lay schools, and I remember with pleasure several of my old teachers, rough and unpolished men, most of them, but excellent, solid scholars, and full of enthusiasm for learning, enthusiasm which they communicated to their pupils. In some respects, indeed, they resembled the rugged, earnest, scholarly Irishmen of old times, who traveled through Europe to spread religion and learning, as described at pages 54 and 55 farther on. But the famine of 1847 broke up those schools, and in a very few years they nearly all disappeared. But our business here is mainly with the early monastic schools, which became so celebrated all over Europe. Before going farther, it is well to remark that these schools also continued and increased and multiplied as time went on. They held their ground successfully, as the lay schools did, during the evil days of later ages, when determined attempts were made under the penal laws to suppress them, and at the present day they are working all over the country quite as vigorously as in days of yore. To notice all the monastic schools of old that attained eminence would demand more space than can be afforded here. So we must content ourselves with mentioning the following, all of which were very illustrious in their time: Bangor, County Down; Lismore, County Waterford; Clonmacnoise, Armagh, Kildare, Clonard, Meath; Clonfert, Galway; Durrow, King's County; Monasterboice, near Drogheda; Rosscarbery, County Cork; and Derry. Besides these, at least 25 others, all eminent, are specially mentioned in our old books. Most of these colleges were working, not in succession, but all at the same time, from the 6th century downwards. When we bear in mind that there were also during the whole period the lay schools, which, though smaller, were far more numerous, scattered all over the country, we shall have some idea of the universal love of learning that existed in Ireland in those days, and of the general spread of education. No other nation in Europe could boast of so many schools and colleges in proportion to size and population. Many of the monastic colleges had very large numbers of students. In Clonard there were 3,000, all residing in and around the college, and Bangor, founded by St. Comgall, and Clonfert, founded by St. Brendan the Navigator, had each as many. And there were various smaller numbers, 2,000, 1,500, 1,000, 500, down to 50. The students were of all classes, rich and poor, from the sons of kings and chiefs down to the sons of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers. Young laymen for general education, as well as ecclesiastical students for the priesthood. All those who had the means paid their way in everything. But there were some who were so poor that they could pay little or nothing. And these poor scholars, as they afterwards came to be called, received teaching, books, and often food, all free. But most of even the poorest did their best to pay something. And in this respect, it is interesting to compare the usages of those long past times with some features of the college life of our own days. In some of the present American universities, there is an excellent custom which enables very poor students to support themselves and pay their college fees. They wait on their richer comrades, bringing up the dishes, etc., from the kitchen for meals, and lay the tables, and when the meal is over they remove everything, wash up dishes and plates, and put them all by in their proper places. In fact, they perform most of the work expected from ordinary servants. For this they receive food and some small payment, which renders them independent of charity. And the pleasing feature of this arrangement is that it is not attended with any sense of humiliation or loss of self-respect. During study and lecture hours, these same young men, having put by aprons and napkins, and donned their ordinary dress, are received and treated on terms of perfect equality by those they have served, who take on no airs and do not pose as superiors, but mix with them in free and kindly intercourse as fellow students and comrades. All this was anticipated in Ireland more than 1,000 years ago, for a similar custom existed in some of the old Irish colleges. The very poor students often lived with some of their richer brethren and acted as their servants, for which they received food and other kinds of payment. Many of these youths who served in this humble capacity subsequently became great and learned men, as indeed we might expect, for boys of this stamp are made of the best stuff, and some of them are now famed in our records as eminent fathers of the ancient Irish Church. The greatest number of the students lived in houses built by themselves or by hired workmen, some mere huts, each for a single person, some large houses for several, and all around the central college buildings there were whole streets of these houses, often forming a good-sized town. Where there were large numbers, great care was taken that there should be no confusion or disorder. The whole school was commonly divided into sections, over each of which was placed a leader or master, whose orders should be obeyed, and over the whole college there was one headmaster or principal, usually called a Ferlegin, that is, man of learning, while the abbot presided over all, monastery and college. The Ferlegin was always some distinguished man, of course a great scholar. He was generally a monk, but sometimes a layman. For those good monks selected the best man they could find, whether priest or layman. I suppose those who are accustomed to the grand universities and colleges of the present day, with their palatial buildings, would feel inclined to laugh at the simple, rough-and-ready methods and appliances of the old Irish colleges. There were no comfortable study rooms, well furnished with desks, seats, and rostrums, no spacious lecture halls. The greater part of the work, indeed, was carried on in the open air when the weather at all permitted. At study time the students went just where they pleased, and accommodated themselves as best they could. All round the college you would see every flowery bank, every scented hedgerow, every green glade and sunny hillock occupied with students, sitting or lying down, or pacing thoughtfully, each with his precious manuscript book open before him, all poring over the lesson assigned for next lecture, silent, attentive, and earnest. Then the little handbell tinkled for some particular lecture, and the special students for this hurried to their places, and seated themselves as best they could, on chair, stool, form, stone, or bank, and opened their books. These same books, too, were a motley collection, some large, some small, some fresh from the scribe, some tattered and brown with age, but all most carefully covered and preserved, for they were very expensive. You now buy a good school copy of some classical author for, say, half-a-crown. At that time it would probably cost what was equivalent to £2 of our present money. Then the master went over the text, translating and explaining it, and whenever he thought it necessary questioned his pupils to draw them out. After this he had to stand the crossfire of the students' questions, who asked him to explain all sorts of difficulties, for this was one of the college regulations. There were no grammars, no dictionaries, no simple introductory lesson books, such as we have now. The students had to go straight to the Latin or Greek text, and where they failed to make sense, the master stepped in with his help. And in this rugged and difficult fashion they mastered the language. Yet it was in rude institutions of this kind were educated those men whose names became renowned all over Europe, and who, for the period when they lived, are now honored as among the greatest scholars and missionaries that the world ever saw. The great Irish colleges were in fact universities in the full sense of the word, that is to say, schools which taught the whole circle of knowledge. They were indeed in a great measure the models on which our present universities were formed. The Latin and Greek languages and literatures were studied and taught with success. In science, the Irish scholars were famous for their knowledge of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, music, geography, and so forth, and they were equally eminent in sacred learning, theology, divinity, and the Holy Scriptures. The schools proved their mettle by the scholars they educated and sent forth, scholars who astonished all Europe in their day. Sedulius of the 5th century, whose name is still represented by the family name Shiel, an eminent divine, orator, and poet, traveled into France, Italy, Greek, and Asia, and composed some beautiful Latin hymns which are still used in the services of the Church. Fergal the geometer went in 745 from his monastery of Achabo in Queen's County to France, where he became famous for his deep scientific learning, and where he taught publicly, and probably for the first time, that the earth is round, having people living on the other side. John Scotus Erigena, John the Irish-born Scot, of the 9th century, taught in Paris. He was the greatest Greek scholar of his time, and was equally eminent in theology. St. Columbanus of Bobbio, in Italy, a Leinsterman, a pupil of the College of Bangor, proved himself, while in France and Italy, a master of many kinds of learning, and was one of the greatest, most fearless, and most successful of the Irish missionaries on the continent. These men, and scores of others that we cannot find space for here, spread the fame of their native country everywhere. It was no wonder that the people of Great Britain and the continent, when they met such scholars, all from Ireland, came to the conclusion that the schools which educated them were the best to be found anywhere. Accordingly, students came from all parts of the known world to place themselves under the masters of these schools. From Germany, France, Italy, Egypt, came priests and laymen, princes, chiefs, and peasant students, all eagerly seeking to drink from the fountain of Irish learning. And let us bear in mind that in those days it was a far more difficult, dangerous, and tedious undertaking to travel to Ireland from the interior of the European continent than it is now to go to Australia or China. But even in much greater numbers than these came students from Great Britain. An English writer of that period, who was jealous of the Irish schools, and in a very bad humor with his countrymen for coming to them, is nevertheless forced to admit that Englishmen came to Ireland in fleet loads. In our histories of Ireland we have read of the real Irish welcome they received, as recorded by the Venerable Bede and by others, and how the Irish not only taught them, but gave them books and food for nothing at all. It was quite a common thing that young Englishmen, after they had learned all their own schools were able to teach them, came to Ireland to finish their education. The more the students crowded to the Irish schools, whether from Ireland itself or from abroad, the more eagerly did the masters strive to meet the demand, and by studying more and more deeply the various branches of learning, so as to equal or excel the scholars of other countries. Then Ireland became the most learned country in Europe, so that it came at last to be known everywhere as the Island of Saints and Scholars. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. How Irish missionaries and scholars spread religion and learning in foreign countries. Towards the end of the 6th century the great body of the Irish were Christians, so that the holy men of Ireland were able to turn their attention to the conversion of other people. Then arose an extraordinary zeal for spreading religion and learning in foreign lands, and hundreds of devoted and determined missionaries left our shores. There was ample field for their noble ambition, for these were the Dark Ages, when the civilization and learning bequeathed by old Greece and Rome had been almost wiped out of existence by the barbarous northern hordes who overran Europe, and Christianity had not yet time to spread its softening influence among them. Through the greater part of England and Scotland, and over vast regions of the continent, the teeming populations were fierce and ignorant, and sunk in gross superstition and idolatry, with little or no religion at all. To begin with the Irish missionary work in Great Britain. The people of northern and western Scotland, who were solidly pagan till the 6th century, were converted by St. Columcille and his monks from Iona, who were all Irishmen, for Iona was an Irish monastic colony founded by St. Columcille, a native of Tyrconnell, now Donegal. In the 7 kingdoms of England, the Heptarchy, the Anglo-Saxons were the ruling race, rude and stubborn, and greatly attached to their gloomy northern pagan gods. We know that the kingdom of Kent was converted by the Roman missionary St. Augustine, but Christianity made little headway outside this till St. Aidan began his labors among the Northumbrian Saxons. Aidan was an Irishman who entered the monastery of Iona, from which he was sent to preach to the Northumbrians on the invitation of their good king, Oswald. He founded the monastery of Lindisfarne, which afterwards became so illustrious. He was its first abbot, and for 30 years it was governed by him, and by 2 other Irish abbots, Finnan and Coleman, in succession. He and his companions were wonderfully successful, so that the people of the large kingdom of Northumbria became Christians. Not only in Northumberland, but all over England, we find the present-day evidences of the active labors of the Irish missionaries in Great Britain. Whole crowds of ardent and learned Irishmen traveled on the continent in the 6th, 7th, and succeeding centuries, spreading Christianity and secular knowledge everywhere among the people. On this point we have the decisive testimony of an eminent French writer of the 9th century, Eric of Auxerre, who himself witnessed what he records. In a letter written by him to Charles the Bald, King of France, he says, "What shall I say of Ireland, who, despising the dangers of the deep, is migrating with almost her whole train of philosophers to our coasts?" And other foreign evidences of a like kind might be brought forward. These men, on their first appearance on the continent, caused much surprise, they were so startlingly different from those preachers the people had been accustomed to. They traveled on foot towards their destination in small companies, generally of 13. They wore a coarse outer woolen garment, in color as it came from the fleece, and under this a white tunic of finer stuff. The long hair behind flowed down on the back, and the eyelids were painted or stained black. Each had a long, stout walking stick, and slung from the shoulders a leathern bottle for water, and a wallet containing his greatest treasure, a book or 2, and some relics. They spoke a strange language among themselves, used Latin to those who understood it, and made use of an interpreter when preaching, until they had learned the language of the place. Few people have any idea of the trials and dangers they encountered. Most of them were persons in good position, who might have lived in plenty and comfort at home. They knew well, when setting out, that they were leaving country and friends, probably forever, for of those that went, very few returned. Once on the continent, they had to make their way, poor and friendless, through people whose language they did not understand, and who were in many places 10 times more rude and dangerous in those ages than the inhabitants of these islands. And we know as a matter of history that many were killed on the way. But these stout-hearted pilgrims were prepared for all this, and looking only to the service of their Master, never flinched. They were confident, cheerful, and self-helpful, faced privation with indifference, caring nothing for luxuries. And when other provisions failed them, they gathered wild fruit, trapped animals, and fished, with great dexterity, and with any sort of next-to-hand rude appliances. They were somewhat rough in outward appearance, but beneath all that they had solid sense and much learning. Their simple ways, their unmistakable piety, and their intense earnestness in the cause of religion caught the people everywhere, so that they made converts in crowds. A great French writer, Montalembert, speaks of the Irish of those days as having a passion for pilgrimage and preaching, and as feeling under a stern necessity for spreading themselves abroad to combat paganism and carry knowledge and faith afar. They were to be found everywhere through Europe, even as far as Iceland and the Faroe and Shetland Islands. Europe was too small for their missionary enterprise. Many were to be found in Egypt, and as early as the 7th century, 3 learned Irish monks found their way to Carthage, where they labored for a long time and with great success. Wherever they went, they made pilgrimages to holy places, places sanctified by memories of early saints, and whenever they found it practicable, they were sure to make their way to Rome, to visit the shrines of the apostles and obtain the blessing of the Pope. The Irish passion for pilgrimage and preaching never died out. It is a characteristic of the race. This great missionary emigration to foreign lands has continued in a measure down to our own day, for it may be safely asserted that no other missionaries are playing so general and successful a part in the conversion of the pagan people all over the world, and in keeping alight the lamp of religion among Christians, as those of Ireland. Irishmen were equally active in spreading secular knowledge. Indeed, the 2 functions were generally combined, for it was quite common to find a man a successful missionary, while at the same time acting as professor in a college, or as head of some great seminary for general education. Irish professors and teachers were in those times held in such estimation that they were employed in most of the schools and colleges of Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. The revival of learning on the continent was indeed due in no small degree to those Irish missionaries. It was enough that the candidate for an appointment came from Ireland. He needed no other recommendation. When learning had declined in England in the 9th and 10th centuries owing to the devastations of the Danes, it was chiefly by Irish teachers it was kept alive and restored. In Glastonbury especially, they taught with great success. We are told by English writers that they were skilled in every department of learning, sacred and profane, and that under them were educated many young English nobles sent to Glastonbury with that object. Among these students the most distinguished was St. Dunstan, who, according to all his biographers, received his education, both scriptural and secular, from Irish masters there. As for the numerous continental schools and colleges in which Irishmen figured either as principals or professors, it would be impossible, with our limited space, to notice them here. A few have been glanced at in the last chapter, and I will finish this short narrative by relating the odd manner in which 2 distinguished Irishmen, brothers, named Clement and Albinus, began their career on the continent. One of the historians of the reign of Charlemagne, who wrote in the 9th century, has left us the following account of these 2 scholars. When the illustrious Charles began to reign alone in the western parts of the world, and literature was almost forgotten, it happened that 2 Scots from Ireland came over with some British merchants to the shores of France, men incomparably skilled in human learning and in the Holy Scriptures. Observing how the merchants exhibited and drew attention to their wares, they acted in a similar fashion to force themselves into notice like the others. They went through the marketplace among the crowds, and cried out to them, "If there be any who want wisdom, that is, learning, let them come to us, for we have it to sell." This they repeated as they went from place to place, so that the people wondered very much, and some thought them to be nothing more than persons half crazed. Strange rumors regarding them went round, and at length came to the ears of King Charles, on which he sent for the brothers, and had them brought to his presence. He questioned them closely, using the Latin language, and asked them whether it was really the case that they had learning, and they replied in the same language that they had, and were ready, in the name of God, to communicate it to those who sought it with worthy intentions. Then the king asked what payment they would expect, and they replied, We require proper houses and accommodation, pupils with ingenious minds and really anxious to learn. And as we are in a foreign country where we cannot conveniently work for our bread, we shall require food and raiment. We want nothing more. Now at this very time King Charles was using his best efforts to restore learning, by opening schools throughout his dominions, but found it hard to procure a sufficient supply of qualified teachers. And as he perceived that these brothers were evidently men of real learning, and of a superior caste in every way, he joyfully accepted their proposals. Having kept them for some time on a visit in his palace, he finally opened a great school in some part of France, probably Paris, for the education of boys of all ranks of society, not only for the sons of the highest nobles, but also for those of the middle and low classes, at the head of which he placed Clement. He also directed that all the scholars should be provided with food and suitable habitations. It was, in fact, a great free boarding school, founded and maintained at the expense of the king. As for Albinus, he sent him to Italy, with directions that he should be placed at the head of the important school of the monastery of St. Augustine at Pavia. And these schools are now remembered in history as two great and successful centers of learning belonging to those ages. End of chapter 7.